Okay, so we're live, right, Arif?
Live, sir. Done.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah. So good evening, everyone. I'm Sashi. I'll be moderating this webinar. We're just coming off the Diwali week, and I hope everyone's had a great festival. For those of you who are joining our webinars for the first time, a brief introduction to Starof. At Starof, we seek to match people with work more efficiently. That's our vision statement. So what we do is we engage with companies on the one side and candidates on the other side, and try and see how we can generate a better fit between candidates and companies in terms of hiring. We're currently focusing on creating a vibrant community of Java developers where you could find interesting career opportunities. We're also we continuously post engaging resources on our website, for you to learn new things. And we conduct, events where you can actually network with experts, seek help, and with our webinars, especially, we seek to help developers learn new frameworks and tools that make them productive. With these webinars, we bring lighthouse speakers from the creamy layer of the tech world to kind of talk about new frameworks, exciting advances in the field of Java and other web technologies. So leading today's webinar is Simon Martinelli. He joins us from Erlach, Switzerland. A quick introduction about Simon. Simon is a passionate Java performance optimization and application integration expert with more than 25 years of experience in creating efficient programming solutions, initially as a developer, then as an architect, and finally, in his role currently as a team lead and a consultant to large companies. Simon is an active member of the Java community, widely respected. He has made key contributions to JSR 352 batch applications, JSR 354 money, and the currency API, which we use frequently in some of our projects, and which is also quite popular with some of the developers that I know. Simon is also a Vaadin Community Award winner, recognized for his community for his contributions to Vaadin framework. In addition to coaching and teaching clients to optimize their IT architectures and to kind of create high performance applications, Simon also does some teaching. He has been an adjunct professor at Bern University of Applied Sciences in Switzerland. Simon lives in Switzerland, and he runs a company called 72 Services LLC. Simon, thanks for taking the time out to connect with us. We're so privileged to have you on this webinar.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, a quick introduction to the topic at hand. So these days, anybody building a web application knows that UX is not an afterthought. You have to sort of build UX into the core of your development process. It is not something that, as used to be the case, previously, the FANG companies, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google. So these are the companies that had great UX, and the other people sort of got away with less than good UX. But these days, every application is supposed to have baseline quality of UX. Otherwise, people won't take to these platforms. So Vaadin sort of helps developers build great applications with very little effort. Because it has these built-in components, 45 plus UI components that can help you get off the ground quickly, and they're also customizable, which means that you can actually apply your branding, all that, and then also customize the theme and styling and things like that, and build mature looking UIs very quickly with very little effort. Vaadin is as a proof of its value, and as a proof of its real popularity. It is already being used at companies like Netflix, JP Morgan Chase, Primerica, Volkswagen, and a lot of other big names. With Vaadin, the basic benefit, the most essential benefit that people get is that you could build powerful UIs using either Java or TypeScript, or a combination of both, using the flow model. So in recent times, generally, we come across a lot of frameworks, but I really haven't felt as excited about anything as I did about Vaadin. I mean, it's an excellent framework. So we thought, a session on Vaadin will really be useful to, or valuable to a lot of programmers. So we put this session together. It's going to be a combination of some theory around how Vaadin got started, and how it evolved, and we'll also have some code along exercises to kind of get you a feel for the language and how you can use it to build applications. So the structure of the session is pretty straightforward. So there'll be like 50 to 55 minutes where Simon will sort of do the session, and then we have 5 to 10 minutes set aside at the end for Q&A. So the time we want to end is at 7 p.m. But if Simon needs more time, and if you have questions, we could extend it up to 7:15. So with that, I would like to kind of thank Simon once again for joining us, and thank you all for joining us on this webinar. And I hope it will be very exciting for us all. I request Simon to begin the webinar. Simon, over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot for the introduction. So I like to talk to you about Vaadin, and I was already introduced. Maybe my timeline, I started with Java in year 2000, like a lot of people, I think. Before I was programming in COBOL on IBM mainframe systems. And during the last 3 years, I was working with Vaadin for a few customers of mine. And that's why I started to talk about Vaadin, to do some blog posts about Vaadin. And this year, a few days ago, they gave me the Vaadin Community Award, where I'm very proud of. And I'm very happy to be here tonight and to talk about Vaadin. So if we look at Vaadin, why should you use Vaadin? I mean, in my customers field, usually people are using Angular. It's very popular in Switzerland. A lot of companies are using Angular. Some of them are using Vue. And these are all frameworks that use the same model. So you're developing your application in a single page application style. It's classically a client-server programming model where you have the client, let's say you do it in JavaScript or in TypeScript, depending on the framework, and then you have a backend system. And what you will need then is also a REST API between the client and the server. And Vaadin traditionally is different. With Vaadin, you can develop your entire application, even client and backend, with the same model. And it was Java at the beginning. Now we have also a TypeScript model, and I will show you both models that are available now with Vaadin. And here on this slide, I try to explain why to use Vaadin. There are a lot of companies that have in-house applications. You know them. It's a back office application where internal people in a company can enter some data. For example, you have an ERP system where you have a product management or a customer management application, or you have an order management application. And for all these kind of applications, Vaadin is a very good fit because they are all data-centric. That means you have a lot of database tables, you have a lot of data, and you have a lot of UIs. But usually these kind of applications are not customer-facing. These are mostly used by the employees of the company. Another benefit of Vaadin is Vaadin comes with a rich component model. And you can use them also outside of Vaadin, by the way, because they are now based on web components. I will show that later on. And you can use Vaadin components also in other application types. But because Vaadin is a great fit for data-centric applications, there are two types of components that you usually need if you do these kind of applications. First of all, you need a grid or a tree grid or a combination of both, where you display the data in rows. And for that, you usually need paging because you have a lot of data. The user wants to sort the data, wants to filter the data, and this already comes with Vaadin. So it's very easy to create such kind of applications. And on the other hand, if you want to edit data, you need forms, forms with kind of a data binding where you have a validation and conversion of the data. So for example, if you have an integer in the database, you want to convert the string that the user enters, for example, a 0 into an integer. And that's what the strength of Vaadin are. So you have a component model, you have grids and forms that make a perfect fit for data-centric applications. If you have a look at the history, we notice that Vaadin is already 20 years old. So it's not a new framework, but it changed in the last 3 years. So some people of you who might know Vaadin may know Vaadin version 6, 7, or 8. And these versions were all based on Google Web Toolkit. Google Web Toolkit is no longer maintained by Google. It's still under maintenance by the community. But Vaadin decided to make a break and start with a new Vaadin. And this happened when I first used Vaadin in a customer project in 2019. So starting with Vaadin 10 in 2019, the framework completely changed. So it's no longer Google Web Toolkit based. It's based on web components, and they introduced a framework that's called Flow. Flow is the Java-based framework. We will see that in a minute. And what we currently have from the version numbering, we have version 14. That's the long-term support version. Next year in March, there will be a new long-term support version. It will be version 23. And in the meanwhile, they were working on newer features and other features. And a year later in 2020, Vaadin 15 introduced another programming model based on TypeScript and lit element. So this is called Vaadin Fusion, and that's the other way to build applications with Vaadin. And currently we are on Vaadin 21, so my examples will be based on Vaadin 21 as well. So before we start with the demo, let us have a look at the architecture of Vaadin. First, we have a look at Vaadin Flow. So Vaadin Flow is Java-based. What does that mean? That means that you program your UI entirely on the server. So you have an application server, for example, you use Spring Boot, and then you have an embedded Tomcat server, for example. And then you have your Vaadin applications that uses the Vaadin component. So a Vaadin component has a Java class, for example, a text field or a button, and you build your user interface code, also on the server side. And then you can access your business logic, the persistency, depending on how you do that. For example, with Spring, you will access a service or a repository. And you can use HTML templates as well. And you have a great way to do theming. For example, I have customers that do product development. So for example, they do create product for insurance companies, and they have to style the application based on the corporate design of the insurance company, for example. So they can just exchange the theme without changing anything in the application. So that's very well done. Maybe if you know Vaadin 8 or 7, there you used Sass as a CSS preprocessor. Now that's no longer necessary. Vaadin uses CSS3. So that's how we implement applications. Now the question is, how does this comes to the browser? And on the browser, Vaadin uses web components, also HTML templates and the theme. That's downloaded the first time, like with every single page application. And from that point, Vaadin will communicate from the client to the server with the normal REST calls with a special format that they have internally. You can also communicate from the server to the client. There are push capabilities also built into Vaadin, but you will never come in touch with the client. So you will always stay on the server side. And that's why Vaadin Flow is a very good fit for all Java developers, because you don't have to learn TypeScript or JavaScript. You don't have to learn how to develop single page applications, but you can do that without even knowing that with just the Java UI component API. And another benefit of that programming model is that you don't need any REST API, because usually if you do single page application development, you will create your application with React or Angular on the client, and then you have to have an API. And this API is usually a REST API where you have to implement and also test this API. So you have, in fact, you have three parts of your application. You have the client, you have the API, and you have the backend. With Vaadin, you just have one. You have the backend system with the UA integrated. Now, this is some example code just to show how it looks. We have a hello view with a text field and a button. And if you ever developed Java UI with, let's say, Swing, AWT, or maybe Eclipse RCP and SWT, then this looks very familiar. So it's really a Java UI programming model that you get. You have text fields, label, buttons, checkboxes, grids, and so on. So that's very easy to use. We will see that in a minute. Now, the other thing that I like to show you today is Vaadin Fusion. Vaadin Fusion is the new one, so the new version, let's say, of Vaadin. You can use either Flow or Fusion, or you can combine both. And the difference between Fusion and Flow is that you don't develop your UI on the backend or on the Java side, you use TypeScript. Why this even was introduced, you may ask. The point is, Vaadin uses web components. And they thought, oh, maybe we can use web components also to create a programming model for the users of Vaadin. And so they had a look at what they were using. Traditionally, they were using Polymer framework, also from Google, to build web components, but this changed to Lit Element. So Lit Element is the new library that you can use to create web components. And so all the Vaadin Fusion programming model is built on Lit Element, and Lit Element is also used by Vaadin, so you can use right away your components on the client side. We will see that. The difference between the Java model and the TypeScript model is Vaadin Fusion has a reactive style of programming. So that means if you change the state on the client, it will immediately re-render the components and reflect the changed state. So Vaadin Fusion can use to integrate with the Java backend also, and you create the TypeScript front end. But even here, you don't need a REST API, because you will see we will have endpoints and they will be generated, the code on the client side that you can use to access the backend. So you don't have to create a separate REST API layer that you have to test on the client and on the backend. So this will all be generated by Vaadin. And something that I didn't mention is, if you have a look at this programming model here from Flow, we see that we have an exchange. So between client and server. That means every time you change something on the client, this will be reflected on the server. And if you change something on the server, for example, you set the value in a text field, this will be propagated to the client. To do this, Vaadin needs state. So that means if you create a Vaadin Flow application, you have a stateful application on the backend. And if you may have a lot of users and want to scale horizontally, for example, you run it on Kubernetes or any other cloud platform, and you want to have a stateless backend, then you may have a problem with Vaadin Flow. And that's another reason why you could use Vaadin Fusion, because Vaadin Fusion will allow you to be fully stateless on the backend. So we have two questions. First, Philip asks, are there any UI builders for Vaadin? Yes, they are. So there is a Vaadin Designer, it's called. It's a plugin that you can integrate in IntelliJ, for example, and you can use it to design your UI. To be honest, I never use that, because if you're on a Java backend side and if you're an experienced UI developer, you are maybe faster if you do that directly in the code without the UI builder. That's one reason. And the other reason is if you have a highly dynamic UI that we, for example, have in in a customer project where we built a ERP system with Vaadin. There the UI is based on the data in the database. So we have to change that dynamically. And then the UI builder is probably not the best idea. But there is a UI builder that you can use. And if you have static UI, then you are maybe faster with that model. And that's why the HTML templates here come in. So you have the UI definition in HTML template, and you create user interface code for the event listeners, for example. Yeah. And then we have another question from Nishan. Okay. So maybe we can come back to that later on. Now, let's have a look. Or first of all, before I continue, I have to talk about lit. I already said that Vaadin web components are used with lit element or lit template. There is a framework that's called lit, and it's in version 2. And that's a library to build web components. And it's reactive. You have a declarative template system. You will see that. It reminds for people that were using React in the past, it reminds on the model that you have if you use React. And so the Vaadin Fusion code will look like that. So this is TypeScript. It's on the client side. We have a custom element. So custom element decorator here is used to name the element. We will see that in the demo as well. We have some state, and what's interesting, we have a render method, and here between the backticks, we create the template. So you create with Vaadin Fusion, you create the HTML template directly in the TypeScript code. And here you have, for example, listeners marked with this @ sign and the name of the listener. So it's the value changed event that we catch here. And we call this name change method where we set the state. And on the other hand, we have a click listener, for example, here that calls the say hello method. So that's how Vaadin Fusion works. For the communication, we will have endpoints. An endpoint is just a simple class. It's a Spring Boot class in that case, annotated with the endpoint. It uses Spring Security annotations to tell which users can access the method. By default, if you don't have any annotation on that, all the methods are protected. So only logged in users can use this method or call this method from the client. That's an important fact because you usually want to have secure access to the application if you build business applications. So now, before we start with the demo, when to use Flow, when to use Vaadin, when to use Fusion, sorry. I would use Flow if I'm a Java developer and want to do full stack development. And I do a data-centric application where it doesn't matter that my backend will be stateful. So as I said, like an ERP system, a CRM system, any other data-heavy applications that are used in business environment are a perfect fit for Vaadin Flow. If you have another type of application and really want to avoid this server state, then you can go with Vaadin Fusion. The benefit of using Vaadin Fusion in contrast to Angular or React is that the programming model, in my opinion, is easier, and all the deployment and all the build stuff is integrated in one project. We will see that in a minute. So if you want to start with Vaadin, that's very easy these days. You can just go to startvaadin.com. And here you can see that there are two ways that you can program. That's what I've shown you before. We have the Flow framework, we have the Fusion framework, and you can select one of that. And then you have a wizard where you can create your application. So you have here different views that you can create. For example, you can create the master detail view where you have a table with an editor, and you have a hello world here. You also can change the theme. So you can define how it should look like. You can also use a dark theme. These themes also can be switched during runtime, so you can provide a light and a dark theme to the user and they can choose from. That's already built in. And here on that side, you can choose the Java version, for example. Here we see the Vaadin versions. Currently, Vaadin 14 is the long-term support version. We have a Vaadin 21, that's the current version, and we have some pre-release versions that you also can choose from. That's more or less what you can do here. There is also some security configuration that you can use, for example, because Vaadin uses by default, or here it's generating a Spring Boot application. So let's go to this application. I've did this just before the webinar, and I created a Flow application that has two views. It has a Hello World view as well. So that's this one. Here I can type some code, and we have this master detail view that I can use to display data. So this example code already generates these persons here in the grid. And what we can see here that this component is sortable, and when we scroll down, it will page automatically. So I don't have this old style paging where you have the page numbers and you can page from page to page. The Vaadin grid does paging during scrolling. So that's the way it works. And on the other hand, we also already have an editor where I can change the name, for example, and save it. And then we see the name is saved to the database. So how does this work? First of all, if we have a look at the project structure, we see this is a Maven project. We could also use Gradle. You can't use Gradle from the wizard, so that's not yet integrated. They are working on Gradle support in this start.vaadin.com wizard. But there are skeleton projects that you can download, and there is all Gradle stuff already integrated. If we have a close look to the POM, we will see some properties. We use Vaadin Java 17, then we use the most recent Vaadin 21 version. And because it's a Spring Boot project, you can also use Quarkus, by the way. There is Quarkus support. There is also support if you want to deploy a Vaadin application directly in application server. You either can generate a WAR file, because here the default packaging is jar, so this will create a Spring Boot executable jar at the end, but you could also create a web archive that you can deploy then in an application server, or even you can have a skeleton that integrates Vaadin with the traditional servlet stack, and that can then be integrated with CDI, for example. If you're using Java EE, Jakarta EE, this works as well. And then we have dependencies to Vaadin framework. We have also a Spring Boot data JPA that we use, and to show some interesting thing is that we also have a Vaadin Maven plugin. So the important part is we don't have to deal with NPM or Webpack or any other library, because this Vaadin all does in the background. That's if we look at the structure, we have even a node modules directory, we have a package JSON, we have a PNPM file, we have a Webpack configuration. So that means during development time, we use Webpack like you do if you use Angular, for example, or React. But then there will also be a production build that will pack everything together into the executable jar. And at the end, you deploy just the Spring Boot jar. So you don't have a separation between front end and back end. So you create what's called a self-contained system. So you create an application that contains everything that you need. So if we look here at the flow application, this is a traditional Spring Boot application. There is something called a theme. So as I said before, we can theme our Spring Boot our Vaadin application. This can be found in the front-end folder. There we have the theme and the flow. So the name of the theme is flow. And then we have some styles where we can use, or we can use CSS to style the components. And we have also some special imports because Lumo is the default theme. You could also have or use a material theme that's also integrated directly with Vaadin. So that's everything you need to know. We also create a PWA application. That means this can be installed directly, for example, here in the Chrome browser. So I can install my app, and then I will have my Vaadin application, but without the address bar and the bookmark bar, for example, and it looks more or less like a native application. The application, by the way, is also responsive. So if I scroll here, for example, then the menu on the left side disappears. And so this will also work nicely if you would have a look at the application on the client. For example, an Android device or an iPhone. That's everything already integrated. Then if we have a look at the views, first we may have a look at the Hello World. That's the easier one. That's more or less what we've seen before in the slides. Here we really use all these text fields. And if you look at the imports, we see that are components. There are buttons, text fields, and so on. There are many components already built in, but there is also a third-party directory of components. And literally, you can introduce your own web components, or you can combine components. That what I do usually with the customer. I combine components to another component. For example, if we need some special components that have a key text field where we can enter key, and then the text will be rendered depending on what the user enters, or we can use any web component that can be found in the internet. So that works very well. To use Vaadin, and if you're coming from an older version of Vaadin, something changed. What we now have is routing. So that means if I go here to master detail, you can see that the URL changes. So every view in Vaadin is also bookmarkable. So it has a URL. You can even have URL parameters. And then you will get, for example, if I implement an interface, that's called as URL parameter, I can say the path variable could be a string. And then I can implement the method that's called set parameter. And here in this before event, I can access the location. And here on the location, I will get the query parameters, for example. So Vaadin is like a normal web application. That was not the case before Vaadin 10, by the way. So you can bookmark that, or you can send links in an email, and you will get back to the page. So that's a rather boring view. Let's have a look at the master detail view. That's more interesting. And here we see that we can create a grid. So we have a grid. The grid is a Vaadin component that has a type, sample person. Sample person is a class. It's an entity, by the way, with the first name, last name, email, phone, date of birth, occupation, and the flag, important. And then I can add columns and define the property name, for example. There are various ways to create grid columns. That's just one. So I say the first column contain the first name, the last name, and the email, phone, date, birthday, and occupation. And this is exactly what is rendered here. So I make that a little bit smaller. We also see this important flag here that is rendered as a component. but the rest is exactly what I do here. And then we need to set the items, and the items are set using paging. So here directly in this set item method, I can set a callback data provider, and this has a fetch callback. And this fetch callback here must return for sure a stream of persons or demo, what's the exact name? Sorry, the sample person. And the list method in that case is just a Spring Boot service. That's a special one. It's a CRUD service. CRUD service is a helper method coming from Vaadin. And here we have just the repo that we need, and we have methods that we have to implement. We have get, update, delete, list, and count. These are all the methods that we need. And here you see you get this Spring Data pageable object. The pageable object contains the page number, the page size, the offset, and the sort order. And with page size and offset, you can page them. So you can, Vaadin will call the method with the page object directly here, and you can use that. And this method here uses just the find all method of the repository. So we have a JPA repository. In that case, that's here on the data. The sample person repository, that's a normal JPA repository, and find all method is used. That's all the magic that happens here. So populating a grid is very easy. You could also use any other technology. I use Juke, that's a SQL framework that I can use to have a type-safe SQL way for SQL development, or you can use Spring Data JDBC or whatever you like. Now, what's interesting is how do we use the form. So we have the grid here, that's nice, but here on the right-hand side, we also can enter data, for example, change the date. And how happens this? So what we have here, we have value change listener on the select event. And what we do then, we do a binding of the sample person to the fields. And doing binding in Vaadin is always done with a binder. There are various types of binders. For example, we here have a bean validation binder. Bean validation binder means that the bean validation binder, if we have annotations here, we don't have, but we could use some not null constraints, for example. So the binder would consider also the bean validation annotations. So the binder in Vaadin is responsible of binding the data to the fields. And so we create our form, for example. We create a text field for the first name, for the last name, for the email, etc. And then we can use the binder to do conversion and validation and so on. So this all happens here because we say binder bind to instance fields. And bind to instance fields means that the binder binds the text fields that are here directly created as attributes of this class. That's one way that you can do that. The other way is you can also bind the fields in another way. There's a bind method, and with that bind method, you can bind text fields to the data. And let's have a look if I can show you that in a minute with a different project. No, we'll do that later on. So that's the binder that binds the data. And at the end, we will have a save button, and the save button will do nothing else than sending the data to the method here. So we have the save, and we have a click listener, and the save listener will first of all use the binder to write the bean to the sample person, and then we use this sample person and call update, and update at the end will call again the save method of the JPA repository. So that's more or less everything we need to do. And then we clear the form. So, and then we refresh the grid. And refreshing the grid is called by, is done with the data view that we get from the grid. We can call refresh. And then if you call refresh, it will reload the data. So that's the model, how we use for Vaadin on the server side. So you see there is absolutely no JavaScript, no TypeScript involved. Now, what if you want to use the other Vaadin model? Then we can have a look at the other application. So I created the exact same application, but this time with Vaadin Fusion. If you look at the backend, or if you look at the structure, we see that it looks similar. So it's more or less exact the same POM file. So even here, if we use TypeScript, we don't see any NPM, we don't see any Webpack. That's all done by the Vaadin plugin in the background. So we don't have to deal with that. So even populating the package JSON file here, as we can see, that's generated by the Vaadin plugin. But if we look at the backend system, we see the service. So we have the sample person repository like before. We have the sample person service. But what we don't have is we don't have the UI code. But we have something else. We have an endpoint. And we have this sample person endpoint here that uses the sample person service. And you can think of that's the API for the client. The only difference is that we don't use a REST controller here, as what we would do if we would use Spring Boot and Spring MVC to create the REST endpoints. But we have an endpoint annotation. This endpoint annotation is a Vaadin Fusion annotation. Here we have the security. So in that case, we don't have a security in place. We don't have a login. So we just allow everybody to access this endpoint. And what will happen in the background if you use this endpoint annotation, then there will be a generation of a TypeScript file that also is called sample person endpoint, but this time this is a TypeScript file. And this TypeScript file, you don't have to understand the code, that's just generated. And this endpoint has the exact same methods as we have on the backend. So we have update, we have list, get, delete, count. These are the methods that we have here: list, get, update, delete, and count. That's everything is generated. You don't have to care about client-server communication. Maybe you spotted already the non-null annotations. These are Vaadin Fusion annotations, and they are used for the TypeScript generation to make the generation easier. So if you add non-null here, then the TypeScript generator knows that you will never return null. You will always return a list. And there is also, and that's why there is a known annotation and not used the not null annotation from bean validation. The non-null is also on the type. So we also will not return null values in the list. And then we have the non-null on the sort order fields, for example, or on the ID or on the entity. And this is also used for the generation. So that's what will be generated. Now, let's have a look at how the application works. First of all, you see here an index HTML. That's a shell page, like you have with Vaadin, like you have with Angular. And this is just used because this is the file that gets downloaded in the browser then. And then we have also an index, a TypeScript file. There we have set the routes. So we create a router And routing looks like with any other single page application framework. So you have a path, you have a component that is called, for example, the path, the empty path will go to hello world, or the hello path will go to the same view, or we have a master detail path that will then render the master detail component. So that's more or less how it works with every other framework. And now comes the interesting part. So first have a look at the hello world example. The hello world view looks similar to the Java code that we've seen before. We have here a custom element that's called hello world. So let's have a look what this means. So if we go to the Fusion project, that's the Fusion project, and I check the code here. Let's move that to a place where you can see it. Here we are. Make it a bit bigger. And here we see we have a component. So if you don't know about web components is a way to extend HTML. So you just not only have like body or div or any other HTML component, you also have your own web component. So for example, main layout is a component from Vaadin, and this hello world view is a component that I create with TypeScript. So this is exactly this component here. Then we have some state, the name. The connect callback is something that's coming from lit. So we extend here from view. View is from Vaadin, and this extends mobx element, and mobx extends mobx lit element. And so the mobx lit element is a lit element at the end. So that's from the lit framework. And what we can do here, for example, we can add classes. So Vaadin introduced CSS classes like you have if you use Bootstrap or any other of these CSS frameworks. Something like this is also integrated into Vaadin. And what's interesting is the render method. So here we create the Vaadin text field, we create the Vaadin button, and we change here, or we say hello, we show a notification if we click on the button. So this works like the Java part, but that's not so interesting. So what would be more interesting is to see what will happen if we do it in a reactive style. And for that, I changed the code a bit. So I will go ahead and create the paragraph instead of the button. And here I like to introduce or have my name displayed. So with the $sign and the curly braces, I can access the state. And now let's see what happens if I do that. So let's move this away. And now this is gone, but nothing happens. Huh? I can enter here something. That's because this attribute here, or this class variable, is not known by the framework. So there is a decorator, by the way, it's called Decorator with TypeScript. We can add this, it looks like an annotation in Java. We can add the state decorator, and then lit element will observe the changes on this field. And now, if I type here, you can see this will immediately reflected or re-rendered in the paragraph tag that I entered. That's because of the state. The state is internal. That means you cannot access it from outside, but there is also the possibility to use properties. So properties are attributes of the web component. So if I change that from state to property, we have the same mechanism, but we will have the element here. So we have our hello world view. And now what I can do is I can set the attribute name directly here if I like to. So if I want to use this component from elsewhere, and Starof, and now the attribute Starof is filled, and we see that's here bound directly to the component. So that's the difference between property and state. So that's an easy example, and I would really say if you use React now, you will find yourself familiar with the Vaadin Fusion programming model. Expect that it uses TypeScript. TypeScript, in my opinion, as a Java developer, is an advantage because it looks like Java. It's also type safe. That's an important fact. So it has classes, and so it's more familiar for a Java developer. Now, because I created exactly the same application, I also have a master detail view here. And here we have also a grid element. So the grid is the same component as we had on the server side. What we see here is another decorator. That's a query decorator. The query decorator uses selectors like the ID, for example, here. And with that, you can access then the grid element from the template into your code. That's why we use this query here. Here we have a property. So the grid size can be set from the outside. And we have a data provider and the binder. So we have the same, more or less the same classes as we have on the server side. So if you're coming from Vaadin Java model, Vaadin Flow to Vaadin Fusion, it would be relatively fast to get familiar because the names are the same, the classes are the same, the mechanisms are the same. The only difference is you don't create a new Vaadin grid, but you use the Vaadin grid here in a template. And we have the size here, and we have this data provider. We have also an item change event, and this item change event will call the item selected method. And here we get the sample person from the items, and then we use the binder to read this entity from the backend. So we use the sample person endpoint, get the endpoint sample person from the backend, because we want to make sure that when we select it, we don't want to change outdated data, and then we read it in the binder, and so the behavior in the client is exactly the same. So if we go here, we have, for example, Yoila, we can change then the date, save it, and it will be immediately saved to the backend. The only difference is that here we have to implement the calls to the backend, but that's very easy because we just can call the backend, and you see everything here is also in reactive style. So we have this async await here inside the methods to call that asynchronously. And here we also have the form layout with the text fields, with the date picker and so on. And we also have the button, and here we have the save that has a click listener, and then the click will directly submit the content of the binder. That's a bit different API here on the binder on the Fusion side, where you can submit the content of the binder to a method of the endpoint. So that's for the convenience. We don't have to get the person and then send the person to the update method of the endpoint. We just call submit on the binder and pass the method that should be called on the endpoint. And then we clear the form and we refresh the grid and show a notification. So that's exactly the same way as it works. So to do a short conclusion about what I've shown you before is, I would say, or I prefer Vaadin Flow, because I'm a Java developer. And I usually work with customers that have this data-centric, data-heavy applications. And that's very easy because if you're a Java developer, you will be familiar with Vaadin Flow right away. So it's very easy to use. Go to start.vaadin.com, try it out for yourself. It's very easy to use. With both frameworks, even is it Flow or Fusion, it doesn't matter. You don't have to care about client-server communication. With Vaadin Flow, it's totally hidden from you. And in Vaadin Fusion, you just use the endpoint annotation and the client will be generated for you. So you don't have to care about communication. So it's comparable. If you already know Java for a long time, we had Java remote method invocation. It's more or less kind of the same concept. What's common for both component frameworks like Flow and Fusion, you can concentrate on building the application. You don't have to care about build configuration. You don't have to care about installation of Node because Node will be installed, but it will directly be installed by the Vaadin plugin. You don't have to care about it. You just have your main or Gradle build and everything just works. And in many cases, a single deployment that you will get at the end is very convenient for a lot of applications that you use. So you don't have a split deployment from the client and the server. You have to put the server somewhere and put the client code somewhere and make sure that client and server are from the same version, that they work together. You don't have to care about that. With Flow and Fusion, you get a single deployment at the end. So that was my introduction of Vaadin. Do you have any questions? Okay, no questions.
Oh, I'm sorry, Simon. So
Yeah.
I've got some, we're receiving some questions on the chat, so we would answer them. And I also have a couple that I've received directly.
Okay.
Yeah. So one is from Anshuman. So he wants to, sort of know if there's been any study of the performance differences between Node.js and obviously Vaadin Java, and then do you have any insight into which one's faster, slower, that sort of a thing?
No, I don't have, but they are hardly comparable. Because if we're using Spring Boot with Spring MVC, we have a thread-based model, whereas Node.js is a reactive programming model. So I'm sure there are a lot of comparisons between Java and Node.js from the performance side, but I don't have any pointer to one of these. But you will find them for sure. Just Google that.
Yeah. And one of the questions I have received from Vishal is, given that Vaadin's an opinionated web stack, it kind of builds in a lot of assumptions about what programmers need. Have you run into any use cases where the ability to customize is limited?
No, absolutely not, because it's not limited. The point is, we have, let's check. If you go to Vaadin, you find, first of all, the components, and they're ready to use. I don't know how many they are, maybe 30 or something like
45,
that.
45, I believe, yeah.
Okay, and they just work for most of the applications. But in the third-party directory, there are a lot of components. They are not from third-party. Many of them are from Vaadin people directly. And here we have 2,941, but these are for No, these are for Vaadin platform. So Vaadin platform means they are for the new versions. So there are plenty of stuff. But you also can integrate any other web component that you like. You can write your own web components, and you can also execute JavaScript code from the Java side. That's something I didn't show you because it's an advanced use case, but sometimes we have to do that.
Right. On scalability, there's another question on scalability. Nishant wants to know if there are any scalability concerns when using Vaadin apps.
The point is that, as I said, with Vaadin Flow, you have state on the server. So that means if you run it, for example, on a cloud platform, you have to make sure that you have sticky sessions configured on the front end load balancer, so that every request goes to the same node, because you could share the state with the distributed cache, for example, but this is not a good idea because Vaadin communicates a lot from the client to the server. So maybe I can show that right away. If we go to the Vaadin Flow application and have a look at what happens on the network here, you see if I type something, here we have a request. Or if I click, we have requests. So these special requests here are initiated by Vaadin. And this is the synchronization between the client and the server state. So for that, you are bound to this session state, and that could be in certain situations a problem. But as I said, if you use Vaadin Flow, you usually create applications that don't have millions of users or thousands of users, because they're usually data heavy and used for business applications. If you have a lot of load and want to avoid this statefulness, then you can go with Vaadin Fusion. Then this is a way, because with Vaadin Fusion, there is just communication only if you call an endpoint. All the other thing that you do is just on the client side. So that's also a reason why they introduced Vaadin Fusion last year.
Got it. Yeah. And so last question for the evening. The question is from Sushruth Nagaraj. So he wants to know if you have heard about any big Indian tech companies using it in production environments. Probably because in the introduction I mentioned Vaadin is used at JP Morgan Chase, Volkswagen. Maybe we can broad base that question, and you could talk about some of the large companies using Vaadin. Any examples that you know of?
Yeah, I don't know, because I'm not a Vaadin employee. I don't know what customers they have, and all my customers are in Europe, so I can't answer this question. But you can, Vaadin as a company has 150 employees. So based on that number, they have a lot of customers around the globe. But if you want to know if they have, if you like to have a showcase or something, or a reference from a company in India, just go ahead and ask Vaadin. They will help you or tell you names of customers that you can ask.
Okay, great. Yeah, and generally this is the last question, Simon, that we ask everyone who kind of talks on our webinars. Are there any resources that you could point to that developers can use to learn Vaadin? Is there an ideal learning path?
Go to vaadin.com, and there is a learning or a learning center. It's called, and here you find everything. So there is a whole course with many lessons that you can go ahead. So there are webinars. There is also a training. So you have a foundation and the professional. I will do this too. First, I will start with the foundation. These are six lessons, and then you can go to the professional and you can learn. There are also certifications. So there is a Vaadin professional certification and a Vaadin programmer. I don't know exactly what the name is. I'm certified with both of them. And then you can, there's a Vaadin certified developer, that's the entry level, and then you have the Vaadin professional certification. And if you do these 2 courses, you should be able to take the certification as well. And who knows, maybe this would be valuable for you in your future career.
Right. I think we're good. As far as the questions are concerned, Simon, I just want to kind of tell you that we've received. You can see on the chat as well, a lot of appreciation for the session. Most of them found it very interactive. The code walkthroughs are really, really interesting. So, gave us like a flavor of how to use Vaadin and how expressive it is as a framework to use for developing language. So thanks a lot for taking the time out and for doing a really great session.
Yeah, thank you too for having me. It was great to be here. You may notice that I'm a big fan of Vaadin because I use it now for 3 years every day, and I wouldn't exchange it for any other framework currently.
Right. Yeah. So thanks a lot, Simon, and we wish you a good day.
Yeah. Thank you too.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. Bye-bye.